time to put the motor together. For this model, we're going to use an HWC 29. It's covered in another thread on gas-powered thoughts. I'll go over it briefly here. It's an electronic ignition model. The magneto's been removed and replaced with this small aluminum wheel that has a trigger magnet on it. There's a separate electronic ignition unit. The engine, this particular one is the 3D Extreme. It's had some modifications done to the port work and been balanced, so it should run fairly smooth. A couple of things I want to talk about here. One is the cooling shroud. A couple of things that are unique about it. If you look inside, it's actually got some guides that are molded into it. This is sort of unique. A lot of these shrouds are just plain plastic. This one has guides in it. The other thing that's interesting is how tightly it fits against the cylinder. I mean, it slides right up against the cylinder, basically keeping the air from going along the outside. It's a really good shroud design. As far as the fan goes, it's a double row fan. This is really very similar to the fan in the RC motor, which is just incredibly effective. Having used this on another motor, I can tell you it works quite well also. And the clutch, it's a big 59mm clutch, threads into the flywheel, or the fan hub, if you will. And other than that, we'll go over the parts individually. Before we mount the fan shroud plate, you want to mount this cross member support on the back of it. There are flats on this support that go up against the plate, bolted in with 3mm bolts. To help you align it, take the long 3mm bolt, slide through there. Actually, it's 2mm. And then you can tighten this down fully. Before the fan shroud mount goes on the motor, you want to position these little spacers. These things are very small. They're about less than ½ a millimeter. What these things do is, these are mass-produced motors effectively, so the exact position of the crankshaft can be somewhat different from motor to motor, as can the cases. So what they've done is provide these little spacers that make sure there's enough of a gap between the top of the fan and the shroud when you put it all together so that it doesn't interfere. And you may or may not have to put these in. I normally put them in because usually I have to. All you're going to do is just set these on each of the 4 posts and then bolt this on top of it using these flathead 5mm bolts. Okay, you can see this mounted on. The bevel side of the bolt holes face up, and obviously this cross member support is on the bottom of the fan shroud mount. You can go ahead and thread lock and fully tighten these. The next thing that's going to go on is the fan, and pay attention at the bottom of the fan. There's basically a clamp. There's a bolt here. We're going to tighten that up after it's on the motor. You're going to need this M6 bolt and washer to put this on. Basically, it just drops on, and then you tighten this down using thread lock. Now, in order to do that, you don't ever want to grab the motor on the back, because you can twist the crankshaft. You want to use a piston stop like this. Century makes them, other companies make them. Simply threads into the spark plug hole, locks the top of the piston. That way the motor can't turn. So when you're cranking on this bolt, the motor can't turn, and it'll help you get it tight. Okay, once this bolt is in and tight against the crankshaft, you want to go to the clamp bolt inside the fan, tighten this up good and tight. Make sure you get your wrench on it in the right way so you don't screw it up. You'll want to put blue thread lock on that. Get that good and tight. Don't kill it, but get it tight. At that point, we're ready to put the fan shroud on. which you're going to have to take the piston stop out to get that to fit. Simply slips right over the motor like that. And you're going to use M2 bolts, one on each side, and then the long one through the back that we used for alignment. Don't over tighten these because you'll strip the plastic. They just need to be snug. You don't need to put CA on them. You just need to snug them up. Once the fan shroud is mounted onto the motor, tightened down good, we're ready to put the clutch on. As I said earlier, the clutch is threaded and spins on. Now, something that's a little different here, the model's set up so that you can tune the height of the clutch into the clutch bell. Like I said earlier, there's variables in these cases and in the crankshafts as to the exact position of the fan and obviously the clutch. So in some cases the clutch may not seat far enough into the bell, and some of the shoes may be protruding from beneath it. So Century's provided two little spacers. They look to be made out of brass, and once the motor's in and the clutch is installed, you can use these to space this as required to get the clutch fully into the bell. Now the bad news is until a model's halfway put together, you're not going to know you need to do this. But the clutch does not need to be threaded in so tight at this point you can't get it out. You just want to snug it down. If you do need these, they just slip over like so, and you can use one or both of them depending on how far you need to move the clutch up. You may not need to move it at all. It just depends on the tolerances of the particular motor that you have. So we're going to spin it on without any for the moment. And you do need, well, you don't really need the piston stop just to snug it down at this point. Okay, almost done with the motor at this point. The last thing we're going to put together here is the throttle arm for the carburetor. Century provides a little aluminum piece. You mount a ball on it like so, and you put the set screw in place, and this is just going to slip over the carburetor like so. Now, I don't know what the current situation is on these. The one I got was for the older style carburetor, like the 643s, which this arm is actually much smaller, or this axle is much smaller. This is a 990 carburetor. That's probably what comes on all the HWC motors. Because of that, I had to drill this out. I used a number 12 drill. It's aluminum, it's really easy to drill, and it fits over it really pretty simple. So what you want to do here is you want to get equidistant throws between fully closed and fully open. And the way to do that is just snug the set screw down a little bit and then just eye this thing in so that it looks like it's moving about the same distance in both directions, and then you can tighten this on down with thread lock on all these parts. At that point the carburetor is ready to go on. We're going to put it and the muffler on later in the assembly after the model's largely assembled, so you can set this aside for now. Now that we've got the engine prepared, we're going to install it into the motor frame, landing gear frame that we built earlier. To start with, you're going to take the little triangular front motor mount, use a 4mm bolt, thread it into the top of the cylinder head. All PUH motors have a threaded hole that's just below the spark plug cutout. This will clear the cutout in the shroud without a problem. You're going to take the frame like so. This is motor's going to slip through. You're going to be lining up the holes at the back of the motor, the holes at the cross-member support at the bottom of the fan shroud plate, and this triangular mount in the front of the motor is going to be flush on the motor frame. Now the motor's going to attach to the motor frame with M4 bolts. There's two washers. One washer goes between the crankcase and the frame. That's on each side. And then the outer washer goes on the outside of the frame against the bolt head. Don't tighten these down yet. We're going to have to adjust the motor position in a later step. Also, for the front triangular motor mount, you want to use the M-tube socket head bolts with washers underneath the heads. They go through the motor frame like so, thread into this triangular mount in the front. Again, don't tighten any of this up. You want the motor to be able to move in this, because depending on which gear ratio you use, the motor is going to have to be repositioned slightly.